When you tap on a keypad, a letter appears. Keep tapping, the words form a text. Each tap an action that you carry out because you know what happens next. When you scratch your nose, the itch goes away. When you press on a doorbell, it rings. It's our confidence in cause and effect that makes us do so many things. And yet, 300 years ago, David Hume, a cheerful Scot, made clear the idea of causation on which we rely such a lot is logically nonsensical, groundless, indefensible, the opposite of sensible. You think cause exists? It does not. Hume's the top philosopher that Britain has produced, challenging orthodox thinking with the psychology he introduced, raising the profile of human nature to show how it can teach us, however smart we think we are, we're far from rational creatures. He took our inflated view of ourselves and showed us we're not so clever. Plunging a fork into reason's balloon, he punctured it forever. Gregarious, good company, and fond of port and cheese. Too fond, in fact. Red-faced, rotund, and borderline obese. An intellectual heavyweight, Hume was the central figure of Edinburgh's age of enlightenment, with his mix of wit and rigour. The locals called him St. David, a charming fellow to meet, and the road in which he used to live is now St. David Street. In Paris, the French in their salons agreed, and welcomed him as Le Bon David. Famous for his witty bon mot and his natural sense of fun, he did once fall out with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but then so did everyone. So, all things considered, this genial figure is not the one you'd expect to accuse us all of self-deceit, dismiss half our thinking as obsolete, and rip the rug from under our feet by disproving cause and effect. Edinburgh University was where Hume went to college, but he dropped out pretty early, having forced himself to acknowledge the single most important lesson of his education, that studying law was an absolute bore, philosophy his inspiration. Struck by a moment of clarity which he called a new scene of thought, he threw himself into the life of a writer, but soon became overwrought. Today we might say he was suffering from obsessive-compulsive neurosis. Back then, a disease of the learned was his doctor's diagnosis. The art of prescribing medicine has also come a long way, as Hume was put on a course of pills plus a pint of claret a day. He found a welcome change of scene in the French town of La Flèche, where Descartes had studied a century before. Where better to start afresh? The explosion of modern philosophy, once Descartes had lit the fuse, had led to a schism, two schools of thought with directly opposing views. Do ideas come before or after experience? It's a long philosophical story, the battle between a priori and a posteriori. In the rationalist a priori view, all thinking begins in the mind. Before we experience anything, we have thoughts of a subjective kind. For a posteriori fans, the mind's the wrong place to begin. Only after experience do facts spark the thinking within. It's sensations from our surroundings that provide the mind with all data. For empiricist thinkers, experience rules. Reason steps in later. It's not in philosophy's nature to follow the path of nationalism, but Britain developed empiricism while Europe pressed on with rationalism. The empirical perspective had already proved effective for Isaac Newton's law of gravitation. His laws of motion, too, had been calculated through experiment and thorough observation. So, as Newton had done with planets and forces, Hume was now keen to unpick the mechanics of mental activity, to figure out what makes us tick. A Treatise of Human Nature is a title which shows that Hume's goal was a down-to-earth look at behaviour, not a search for a transcendent soul. A bold step into the worldly terrain where Darwin later trod, examining humans like animals rather than children of God. Based on his own experience, David Hume defined two kinds of mental phenomena within the human mind. The first he called impressions, which he identified as those stirred up by emotion within or provoked by sensation outside. These strong impressions, once received, become the original source of the second type: ideas, memories, thoughts, reflections, dreams and mental connections, faint copies of impressions without impressions' force. By putting ideas together, we can think of impossible things. A horse and a bird, combined in our minds, can conjure up horses with wings. So Hume proposed a way to sort out, when ideas are being discussed, which ones to take with a pinch of salt and which ones we can trust. Hume's fork became the name of his claim that there are only two varieties of statement we can be sure are true. The first kind of statement is provable purely inside the mind, the self-evident or logical or mathematical kind, such as 2 and 2 is 4, or a sightless man is blind. In the second kind of statement, the absolute truth can be known through evidence as we sense it, by experience alone. The king is standing up. A cat is sitting on his throne. Hume had many terms for these statements, but by far the most exact are relations of ideas and matters of fact. More complicated ideas can be constructed using these two, but when putting together an argument, no other statement will do. So, when browsing through books of learning, even by famous names, Hume says if they use some other statement, commit it to the flames. Hume was careful how he put it, but the ones he blamed the most were religious fanatics. On Hume's fork, they were toast. This sharp, pointed piece of cutlery to right our thinking's wrongs. Definition or experience, the only two true prongs. Poking around with his sceptical fork, prodding where few would dare, Hume took a deep look inside himself and concluded a self wasn't there. What in fact is going on when our so-called selves are thinking? Thought after thought after thought after thought, separate yet interlinking. But where exactly is the self? Is the question that Hume asks. What rule or law says a self is required at the centre of these mental tasks? Thoughts are occurring, that much is true, but do thoughts need a thinker? You can't prove they do. We have no evidence of the self, is Hume's conclusive report. You may insist, I am thinking this, but that's just another thought. To conceive of a self is, for Hume, paradoxically self-deception. Each time I enter what I call myself, I stumble across a perception. There's a flood of information, but no hub of operations. What we assume is self is just a bundle of sensations. For Descartes supporters, this skepticism is not so good for the health. If you say, there is thinking, therefore I am, what makes you so sure of yourself? Along with the self, another idea that helps us make sense of reality is a massive mistake which Hume says we all make, an unthinking belief in causality. For instance, if we roll a ball across a billiard table to strike a second ball, which rolls, we think that we are able to say the impact of ball A has caused ball B to move. But Hume says we're mistaken. It's not something we can prove. Based purely on perceptions, what do we truly see? We see ball A, we see ball B. But where is cause? We see no C. Two moving balls, but in between, a thing called cause cannot be seen. Strictly on the evidence, what we call causation is a colourful misreading of plain association, an imaginary connection the human mind invents to add a bogus meaning to two separate events. How could rational creatures make such an irrational link? What led the entire human race to develop this glitch in the way that we think? A followed by B, A followed by B. The more that we see A followed by B, the more we expect to see B follow A. And as we keep seeing B follow A, then we start to say A causes B, and B's caused by A. In science, it's known as induction, when a pattern is induced from repeated observation and a theory or law is produced. There's just one snag, which Hume was first to flag. It's almost embarrassing to point it out, the obvious reason why we need to doubt, but humans, quite simply, cannot tell the future. We have no crystal ball. Past experience is useful, but no guarantee at all. You may witness something 100 times, but the 101st event cannot by any provable truth be predicted 100%. We can have a good guess at what happens next based on what's happened before, but we're working with high probability, not magical, mystical wizardry. Supernatural powers are simply not ours. It's the future. How can you be sure? We cannot be certain. Next time we see A, what we see next must be B. Que sera, sera, to quote Doris Day, the future is not ours to see. The expectation that B follows A is a habit, says Hume, nothing more, as coolly thought through as a dog that thinks food when it hears its bowl clank on the floor. Cause is an animal instinct, not an immutable law. However keen you may be to dispute it, no thinker or logician since has managed to refute it. So why do anything? What's the point? Why aren't we frozen by doubt? Hume's problem of induction is such a huge obstruction. Yet happily, as Hume observed, we have found a way out. To live a totally logical life would be nothing short of crazy. The great news for the human race? Our minds are far too lazy. Who cares if cause does not exist? Our attitude's blasé. We carry on as if it does. It's easier that way. Since cause is a central pillar on which our existence depends, a mitigated skepticism is what Hume recommends. Cause is a faulty concept, but still one of the best we've got. As a tool for human progress, it's helpful more often than not. So long as we know it's an error, in Hume's eyes it's forgivable to assume cause as a principle, as it makes our lives more livable. Acknowledge your illogicality, accept it as best you can. Be a philosopher, but, said Hume, amidst philosophy, be still a man. Or woman. Hume's treatise of human nature has many striking features, but this was his greatest bombshell. We are far from reasonable creatures. We like to think we're rational with our lives led by our brains, but inside the human animal, it's more the gut that reigns. Our natural reliance on habit, the force that our feelings transmit, mean what we call thinking is far more instinctive than people would care to admit. The mind is so often an instrument, following raw commands, seeking ways to satisfy our emotional demands. According to the disconcerting argument Hume fashions, reason is the slave of the passions. Hume was still in his 20s when he published this radical work, a controversial, surefire hit that would drive its readers berserk. He'd armed himself with arguments that would knock any critics dead, confident his thoughts had turned philosophy on its head. But to his distress, the world couldn't care less. As Hume himself would later confess, a treatise of human nature fell dead born from the press. For 10 frustrating years, Hume recycled his ideas, convinced that all they needed was rebranding. But his first setback was equalled by his unsuccessful sequel, an inquiry concerning human understanding. Like many struggling writers, Hume compiled a mixed CV while he waited for the fame that he believed was meant to be. Secretary to a diplomat, tutor to an aristocrat who turned out to be something of a crackpot. Librarian, then historian, picking up his pen again. That's where he hit the literary jackpot. 1,000,000 words, 6 volumes, so in every meaning great, Hume's History of England, up to 1688, was written in his 40s and 100 times reprinted. It may not have been the work he loved most, but from then on, Hume was minted. A lesson which still holds for any fact-based storyteller. Philosophy's okay, but if you're in it for the pay, history is the land of the bestseller. It's fair to presume that David Hume didn't thank God for this lucky break, as for him to believe in religion at all was a fundamental mistake. His History of England had included tirades against the callous cruelty during the Crusades, the zeal of fanaticism, blind submission, and the dreadful tribunal of the Spanish Inquisition. But God and Christianity were not to be treated with scorn. Britain's last execution for blasphemy had been shortly before Hume was born. To stay out of trouble, Hume's choice of words was careful, polite, meticulous. Religious errors are dangerous. Those in philosophy, only ridiculous. Ideology in its purest form should be met, Hume said, with rejection, as it always follows that grave philosophic endeavour after perfection. No creed should be given credence if the grounds for it aren't empirical. So, in line with his brief, he did question belief in that advert for God, the miracle. How do we know any claim is true? Hume's argument commenced by saying we weigh up the evidence in favour and against. A miracle, by definition, contravenes nature's laws, so its massive improbability should be enough to make us pause. If the whole range of shared experience runs counter to one single case, when the evidence is weighed, the balance can't be swayed. The miracle cannot have taken place. Hume was aware not everyone would be convinced by such a view, as there's one other big reason people claim miracles are true. What if the person who witnessed the miracle gives in their story's retelling an open, heartfelt and detailed account that is thoroughly compelling? Again, weigh the evidence is what Hume said. If you hear that a man has been raised from the dead, in theory it is clearly happy news for the bereaved, but on balance it's more likely any witness was deceived. Especially if before the event they already had a religious bent, however honest their intent. It's part of human nature to have a sense of wonder. All of us are susceptible to a supernatural blunder. Total belief in a miracle could be fueled by faith inside. Genuine sincerity is not a foolproof guide. Hume's evidence-based approach also helped him undermine a popular argument of the day, linking God to the world's design. This world is designed so intricately, only Almighty God could do it, is a dodgy piece of reasoning, and Hume felt obliged to pooh-pooh it. Assuming designing were involved, it's not proof of a godlike creator. It's evidence of a designing force, just designing. Nothing greater. To attribute this world to a biblical God is a leap, a quite different thing. A clock may be proof of a clockmaker, but not an all-knowing king. On what lies behind the world's design, Hume made this contribution 100 years before Darwin and his theory of evolution. Hume's guillotine is another device he invented to slice through weak thought, as he picked on moral pronouncements involving the words is and ought. How naturally people say X is the case, and therefore we ought to do Y, when this seamless progression from is to ought has no actual logical tie. This is the way things are in the world. Therefore you ought to comply, or therefore you ought to change the world. In neither does reason apply. No assertion of fact, however exact, can be in itself an argument to act. The fact is objective, the motive subjective. Hume's is-ought problem reminds us that morality is rooted in custom, emotion, and instinct more often than rationality. For daring to commit a kind of intellectual treason, using reason itself to rebel against reason, Hume and his impudent line of attack, with no holds barred, has been admired by later philosophers, from Kant to Kierkegaard. Kant thanked Hume for waking him up from a slumber he called dogmatic. Kierkegaard praised him for recasting reason, making its role more dramatic, no longer a means to make us wise, but instead to conclusively show our incredible levels of ignorance, how little we all really know. A lesson for every one of us thanks to Hume's holistic skill. You're quite a clever animal, but remember, an animal still. His calls for evidence, challenging sources, digging with sceptical queries, were good tests for miracles in his time, today for conspiracy theories. Hume's assault on causality was not to spread confusion, but to point out just how easy it is to draw the wrong conclusion. Of all the false beliefs we maintain, cause is one of the oddest, a reminder, however big your brain, to be intellectually modest. Hume's Problem of Induction has kept scientists on their toes, reminding them there's nothing we can ever presuppose. A creative kind of uncertainty. It needn't be doom and gloom. Einstein would never have overthrown Newton, he said, had he not read Hume. Isaiah Berlin was another, for whom Hume was top of the tree. No man has influenced philosophy to a more disturbing degree. Age 65 and dying, as cancer reached its final stage, Hume cheerfully observed it saved him suffering in old age. He joked to those round his deathbed, if he reached the River Styx, he'd bargain with the ferryman for a little more time to fix all the errors made by the human race due to their superstitions. But the ferryman, Hume reckoned, would just sneer at these conditions and angrily complain to him, no matter what he wrote, "That will take you centuries. Now get into the boat."